All right, welcome back. Let's take a look at the different ways we can configure the VMware Certificate Authority in what different modes it has available. Most times, as we mentioned earlier, you're going to want to run this either in its default mode, where you basically are putting in the VMCA root certificates on your client systems if you don't have that many client systems, or you run in what's called hybrid mode, where all you need to do there is replace the vCenter server's machine certificate with a signed certificate from your corporate CA. And so there's two ways of doing this. One way, which is the traditional way, is do it from the vCenter server's command line. Or, now in vSphere 7, it is very simply done from the vSphere client. So here's the more complicated way, right? You go into the vCenter server's command line. Now there's actually, in the vCenter server's command line, there's two ways of doing that. There's actually using an actual command called cert tool, and that's a big, long, kind of complicated command. And then there is a menu-driven program that is a wrapper for the cert tool utility. So that's this tool. It's called the Certificate Manager. And you can take a look at what the different items are in its menu here and kind of get an idea by reading what the descriptions of each of the different options are to know what it is that it's doing. Again, it doesn't have these tuning knobs that says root mode, subordinate mode, hybrid mode, custom mode. No, you actually have to read what it is that it's doing. So for instance, first option number 1, replace machine SSL certificate with a custom CA certificate. That's hybrid mode. So it's the first one in the list, right? It'll prompt you to generate a certificate signing request that creates the appropriate CSR file. You then import it out or export it out of the vCenter system, import it into your corporate CA, have them actually sign it, and then you go back and use option number 1 to replace it. Option number 2 is subordinate mode. Replace VMware CA root certificate with a custom CA certificate and replace all certificates. That's basically going and generating the certificate signing request for a root certificate from the VMCA, use that to then have your corporate CA sign it, and then you then import that here, and then when you replace all those certificates that were issued by the default root certificate of VMCA will now be replaced with certificates that your environment should already trust. So those are probably the two most common you'll ever see or ever use if you're going to do this at all, right? You might replace machine SSL certificates with a VMware CA cert, right? That's you're just replacing the vCenter server's machine certificate with a certificate was generated by the VMCA without actually replacing the certificate in the VMCA. That's the difference between 1 and 3. 1, you're replacing the VMCA certificate with a brand new custom one. In option 3, we're just simply generating new certificates from the VMCA, from however the VMCA has been issuing certificates beforehand. You could regenerate VMware CA root certificate and replace all certificates. Again, you're not creating a custom one here. You're just regenerating it from the VMCA itself. So none of these other ones really are that common. The solution user certificates can be managed through here. Again, you're not going to be doing those too often. In fact, you'll find that solution users are already being deprecated. They probably won't be in future releases of vSphere anyway. So most often you'll end up doing option 1 or option 2, but that still means having to go into this, right? Well, there's also a way of doing this using the vSphere client, and that's what you'll do in the lab. But let me just kind of give you an idea. So we're going to switch over to the lab environment. So give me 1 second. All right, so now we're in the lab environment. And what you do is you go into the administration menu. You go to certificate management, and you'll find the vSphere client basically shows just the fact that in our lab environment, remember we have enhanced link mode, so we have 2 vCenter servers, and so we have trusted root certificates. So we have one VMCA on one vCenter server, and we have the other VMCA on the other vCenter server. In fact, you can see the details here. This says it was issued by the CA, that's the VMware CA, and that this belongs to the Site A vCenter server, and when it's going to expire, right? It's 10 years. Then we go back to the other trusted root certificate. This is from the other vCenter server, SB VCSA, also good for 10 years. And then the vSphere client shows us the one machine certificate that we're interested in here. That's the vCenter server machine certificate, the certificate that the vSphere client will use to connect to vCenter and create a trusted connection. And looking at those details, that one actually lasts until 2022. So it's 2 years. And this is the machine certificate for the vCenter system. So if I ever wanted to go into hybrid mode, it's this one cert that I want to replace. So notice the only thing here that has anything we can do anything with, I can add a new trusted root certificate, but I can also go ahead and generate a certificate sign request to generate a new certificate request for this machine certificate. Fill in all the details about this vCenter system, so that will generate the appropriate file for us. Take that file, the CSR file, to your enterprise or corporate CA, have that system sign this request, and then you go into the actions and you import it. And you'll then have some options here. Would you like to replace with a VMCA certificate? Well, that's actually using the same certificate mechanism that the VMCA was already using. But if I were to replace it with a generated from vCenter server, so that's basically a custom one, or we can replace with a external certificate from a private key. Well, we haven't done that. We just generated a certificate sign request, which is what this middle one does. So then what you'll end up doing is then provide the details of the two different files. Basically, when you have the certificate sign request, it's going to generate a new certificate and will also provide a chain of trusted root certificates. You'll need to provide both files here. You'll have to actually go to the CA chain file and export out of that the appropriate certificate for the root certificate from the corporate CA. Once you've done all that, that will actually disconnect you from this vCenter system because we were establishing a connection with a previous certificate. Now we've got a brand new certificate. You'll have to actually log back in to your vCenter system. You'll also have to clear out the cache on your browser for it to really generate with new certificates. Now, the interesting thing here is our browser, right, Firefox, doesn't trust the certificates that are coming from our corporate CA. Our corporate CA is the domain controller, which is interesting because we're running Windows. Windows trusts our domain controller. And if I was running a different browser, other browsers actually would trust the CA because the Windows OS trusts the CA. But Firefox doesn't act that way. Firefox has its own trusted repository. So you'd have to actually have your corporate CA's root certificate set in your list of trusted certs in your Firefox browser. And then, of course, any certs that were generated by that would then be trusted by the browser, which then would trust our vCenter server, since the vCenter server's machine certificate was generated from a corporate CA, or at least it was signed by the corporate CA. But this is so much easier than it ever was in the past. All you need to do is just these couple steps, and that's what you'll end up doing in the lab exercise. Before I hand you off to the lab, though, just a couple other things to note. If you ever needed to renew or refresh ESXi certificates, right, usually they are going to be automatically renewed by the VMCA. This is the benefit of having the VMCA managing your environment, right? If you renew certificates, you can do that yourself manually, but also if ever if it ever expired, you must disconnect and then reconnect it. It will automatically generate a new certificate for you. But you can do it yourself manually. We'll show you in the vSphere client. Refreshing the CS certificates is also a possibility. This is basically pushing all certificates that are in the VEX Trusted Roots store, and we'll push it to any hosts that need them. One other thing to note, how important is the availability of your VMCA, right? That service running on vCenter. Now, it's part of the Watchdog services, so if it ever fails, it'll get restarted. But if the VMCA is not functioning, what can you not do? You won't be able to add hosts to your inventory because they require to have a certificate, issued by the VMCA in order to join the inventory. Refreshing or renewing certificates on any host, that requires having the VMCA's presence. And then sometimes certificate refreshing on certificate expiry might fail because of the need for vCenter and the VMCA uptime. So if it's unavailable for any short periods of time, that's usually not going to be much of an issue. But yes, let's take a look here. On any vSphere client, you might notice in the hosts and clusters view, if I were to click on any one of my hosts and go to configure, and within here, we have our certificate. So we can actually see the actual SSL, the machine certificate that was issued to this host. So we see this one's good for 5 years, right? And what do we have here? We have some options to manage these certificates so that we can either renew them, or if they were having an expiring date coming soon, or if I just wanted to refresh them, basically get a new copy of them. So our lab is essentially doing what we just demonstrated, except for I only showed you the early steps of this. You're going to go through the whole process. You're going to take a look at the certificates in a little bit more detail. Take your time, understand what the certificates actually look like. Generate a certificate sign request for the custom certificate, like I was demoing earlier. Request a custom certificate from our enterprise CA. That will then sign it. You'll then replace the current certificate with your custom certificate. And again, don't be surprised, your browser is now no longer going to trust that certificate, since Firefox doesn't trust certificates from the domain controller automatically. So we saw here in this lesson that the VMware Certificate Authority and the Endpoint Store are used there to configure your overall vSphere certificate management. We were showing you how to describe solution users and their certificate requirements, describe common VMware CA modes, replace the VMware CA certificates with enterprise or third-party certificates, and the use of the vSphere client to manage the vSphere certificates. Go ahead and do the lab exercise, and I'll see you in the next lesson when you're done.